The restaurant was a sanctuary of candlelight and soft jazz, a place where the elite of the city came to forget their troubles. For Amani Rhodes, it was more than that. It was her first birthday of freedom after 3 years of living in a state of constant, suffocating fear. She sat elegantly in her chair, a slim woman in a dark blouse, finally allowing herself to believe the nightmare of Victor Kane was behind her. She even ordered dessert, a small rebellion against a man who once controlled her every breath. The shift in the room was instantaneous. The air grew cold, heavy with a familiar, rotted obsession. Amani didn't have to look up to know that Victor had found her. Before she could let out a sound, the world tilted violently. Victor's muscular frame loomed over her, his face a mask of possessive rage as his hand clamped around her neck. The pressure was immediate, terrifying, and silent. "You think you can just leave me, Amani?" he hissed, his eyes locked on hers with a sickening satisfaction. "You belong to me." Around them, the world paused. Waiters froze and patrons reached for their phones, but nobody moved to help. As the edges of Amani's vision began to blur, she saw him, a man sitting alone just tables away. Yimin Seo didn't panic. He watched with a cold, calculating focus, his expression as sharp as his jawline. He stood up slowly, the flickering light catching the dark, intricate dragon tattoos winding up his powerful forearms. If you want to see how fast a predator becomes the prey when a true authority decides enough is enough, stay until the end. Because what Yimin Seo did next didn't just save Amani's life, it began the total erasure of her past. "Hello, family. Nice to have you back here. Before we proceed, I would love to know the city you are watching from. Drop it in the comment and also subscribe to this channel if you are new here so you don't miss out on more amazing stories ahead." Now let's dive into the story. The silence in the restaurant was not the peaceful quiet of a luxury establishment. It was the suffocating, airless void that precedes a tragedy. Amani's fingers clawed uselessly at Victor's forearm, her nails scratching against his expensive black dress shirt as her lungs burned for oxygen. Above her, Victor's sharp jawline was set in a mask of jagged, unrestrained fury. He leaned in closer, his shadow engulfing her. 3 years of running, 3 years of hiding in different cities, and yet here he was, reclaiming her like a piece of lost luggage. The diners nearby averted their eyes, their faces flickering in the candlelight as they focused on their plates, terrified that making eye contact with the monster would draw his attention to them. Yimin Seo did not look away. He remained seated, his powerful physique relaxed but his focused, intense eyes tracking every twitch of Victor's muscles. He was a man who moved through the world with the calm of a deep ocean, a silent authority that didn't need to raise its voice to be heard. While the rest of the room was paralyzed by the bystander effect, Yimin reached out, his long fingers wrapping around the hem of his right sleeve. With slow, deliberate precision, he began to roll the fabric upward. The movement was hypnotic. As the white-fitted shirt retreated, it revealed the dark, intricate tail of a dragon, the ink black against his smooth skin. He repeated the motion on his left arm, exposing the muscular forearms of a man who was no stranger to violence. The dragon tattoos seemed to writhe in the dim light, a silent warning of the lethal power he was about to unleash. He stood up, his broad shoulders squaring as he stepped into the aisle. He didn't rush. He didn't shout. He simply walked toward the table where Amani was fatting, her large expressive eyes beginning to flutter as the darkness took hold. Victor felt the change in the air before he saw the man. He sensed a presence that made his own aggression feel small, amateurish, and hollow. He began to turn his head, a sneer forming on his lips, but he didn't get the chance to speak. Yimin's hand shot out with the speed of a striking cobra, his grip closing around Victor's wrist, the one currently crushing Amani's throat. The pressure Yimin applied was not a mere squeeze. It was a calculated, agonizing compression of bone and nerve. Victor's eyes went wide, his mouth falling open in a silent gasp of shock as his fingers were forced to release their hold. Amani collapsed back into her chair, a jagged, desperate sob of air racking her chest as she gripped her neck, her skin already blooming with the dark marks of Victor's possessiveness. She looked up through tears of panic, seeing the back of a man who looked like a fortress. Yimin did not look at her yet. His focus was entirely on Victor, who was now stumbling backward, his face twisted in a mixture of pain and disbelief. "You're making a scene," Yimin said, his voice a low, melodic rumble that carried the weight of a death sentence. It wasn't an observation, it was a reprimand. Victor, fueled by the ego that had allowed him to terrorize Amani for years, tried to reclaim his dominance. He swung a wild, muscular arm at Yimin's face, his brows furrowed in a desperate rage. Yimin didn't flinch. He simply shifted his weight, a subtle athletic movement that allowed the blow to whistle harmlessly past his ear. In one fluid motion, Yimin stepped inside Victor's guard. He delivered a short, sharp strike to Victor's solar plexus, followed instantly by a palm heel to the jaw. The sound was sickening, a dull, heavy thud that echoed off the high ceilings. Victor didn't just fall, he was neutralized. He hit the floor like a bag of wet sand, his aggressive expression replaced by one of dazed, glassy-eyed confusion. The patrons who had been filming on their phones lowered them, the cold dominance radiating from Yimin making them feel like intruders in a space they no longer controlled. Yimin stood over the fallen man for a moment, his expression remains cold and controlled, showing no sign of exertion or adrenaline. He reached down, adjusting the cuff of his shirt with the same meticulous care he had used to roll them up. Only then did he turn to Amani. The sharp cheekbones and intense eyes softened, if only by a fraction. He didn't offer a hand immediately, sensing her instinct to flinch. Instead, he simply stood as her shield, a tall, athletic figure in a white shirt and black trousers, a dragon-inked guardian who had just rewritten the rules of her life. "He won't touch you again tonight," Yimin stated, his silent authority filling the gap where Amani's fear used to live. For the first time in 3 years, the predator was on the ground, and the woman who had been drowning was finally, miraculously, above the surface. The restaurant remained gripped in a fragile, ringing silence as Victor lay groaning on the polished floor, the predator's aura shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. Amani sat frozen, her breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps that burned against the tender skin of her throat. She stared at the man who had intervened, her large, expressive eyes wide with a mixture of shock and a deep, instinctive caution. Yimin Seo did not move to touch her. He understood that to a woman who had just been strangled, any sudden movement was a threat. Instead, he stood like a monolith of white linen and dark ink, his shoulders squared against the rest of the room. With the same deliberate grace he had used to neutralize Victor, Yimin reached into the pocket of his black dress trousers. He pulled out a card, heavy, matte black, and devoid of any company logo or title. It bore only a name and a single phone number embossed in silver. He set it on the table near Amani's trembling hand, his movements calm and devoid of the frantic energy that usually follows a fight. "My name is Yimin Seo," he said, his voice a low, steady anchor in the storm of her panic. "The man on the floor is a coward who relies on the silence of others. That silence ended the moment I stood up." Amani looked from the card to the man. Up close, his features were even more intimidating, sharp cheekbones and a jawline that looked as though it were carved from granite. But it was his eyes that held her. They weren't filled with the erratic heat of Victor's rage, but with a cold, absolute certainty. She reached out, her fingers brushing the cool surface of the card. In the world she had lived in for the last 3 years, a piece of paper, a restraining order, had been a useless shield. But as she looked at Yimin's dragon-inked forearms, she realized this card represented a different kind of law. If he follows you, if he calls you, or if he even thinks about stepping into your shadow again, you call this number, Yimin instructed, his tone brooking no argument. "It does not matter the hour. It does not matter where you are. You are under my protection now." The weight of his words settled over her like a heavy, velvet cloak. For years, she had been the one looking over her shoulder, the one calculating exit routes in every room, the one who had fled across state lines only to be tracked down on her birthday. Now, a man everyone else in the room seemed terrified to even look at was handing her the keys to his empire. The Korean Mafia, rumors she had heard whispered in the city's upper circles, suddenly felt very real, yet for the first time, that danger didn't feel directed at her. It was a wall being built between her and the monster. Victor began to stir, a low hiss of pain escaping his lips as he tried to push himself off the floor. His eyes, once full of a terrifying, possessive fire, were now clouded with a dazed, animalistic fear. He looked up at Yimin, and for a fleeting second the bully's bravado flickered. But before he could even utter a threat, Yimin stepped forward, the heel of his Italian leather shoe landing inches from Victor's face. The message was silent and absolute. Stay down. "You have 5 minutes to leave this establishment and this neighborhood," Yimin told the man on the floor, his voice devoid of anger, which made it all the more chilling. "If I see your face again before the sun rises, you will learn why people don't whisper my name lightly." Victor scrambled to his feet, his muscular frame looking diminished and clumsy as he stumbled toward the exit, not daring to look back at Imani. The restaurant staff, who had been paralyzed, suddenly found their movement, scurrying to open the doors to get the problem out as quickly as possible. Imani watched him go, expecting to feel the usual spike of adrenaline-fueled terror, but it didn't come. The presence of the man standing beside her acted as a lightning rod, grounding her fear before it could consume her. Yimin turned back to her, his gaze sweeping over the dark marks on her neck with a flicker of controlled anger that tightened his jaw. He didn't offer empty platitudes or ask if she was okay when it was obvious she wasn't. Instead, he pulled out his phone and made a short, clipped call in Korean. Within minutes, 2 men in identical black suits appeared at the restaurant entrance. They didn't look like security guards, they looked like soldiers. "They will escort you home," Yimin stated. "They will remain outside your door until I say otherwise. You are no longer alone in this fight, Imani Rhodes." She looked up at him, her lips slightly parted as she finally found her voice. "Why?" she whispered, the question she had been too terrified to ask. "Why help me?" Yimin looked at his own hands, the dragon tattoos visible where his sleeves remained rolled up. "Because I grew tired of watching predators mistake their cruelty for power," he replied simply. He reached out, not to touch her, but to slide the black card closer to her hand. "The city is large, but my reach is longer. From this moment on, you are untouchable. Sleep tonight knowing that the only person Victor Kane should be afraid of is the man who is watching over you." As he walked away, his gait rhythmic and powerful, Imani gripped the black card until its edges dug into her palm. She watched his silhouette disappear into the night, a tall, athletic figure who had just turned her birthday of terror into the first day of her new life. The dragon had claimed her, and for the first time in 3 years, she believed she might actually survive. For the first time in over 1,000 days, the morning light did not feel like an intruder. Imani woke in the silence of her apartment, her hand instinctively reaching for the bedside table, searching for the heavy, matte black card. Her fingers brushed the silver-embossed name of Yimin Seo, and the frantic racing of her heart slowed to a steady, rhythmic beat. She sat up, her natural textured curls spilling over her shoulders as she looked toward the window. Outside, a sleek black sedan sat idling at the curb, its tinted windows reflecting the early sun. She knew, without being told, that Yimin's men were there, not to cage her, but to ensure that the sanctuary she had fought so hard to build remained unbreached. The marks on her neck had faded to a light, yellowish bruise, a receding tide of the violence that had almost claimed her. As she applied a cooling balm, she realized she wasn't looking at the door with the same paralyzing dread. The silence that used to feel like a predator's breath was now just quiet, a luxury she hadn't realized she'd lost. She dressed in a simple, elegant blouse, her movements no longer jerky or rushed. For 3 years, she had been a ghost in her own life, moving through the world with the sole intention of being invisible. But Yimin's intervention had given her a new kind of visibility, one that carried the weight of his silent authority. As she stepped out of her building to head to work, one of the men in a dark suit stepped out of the sedan. He didn't approach her aggressively. He simply gave a respectful, shallow nod and held the door open. He was muscular, with a focused, intense gaze that scanned the surrounding rooftops and alleyways with professional precision. Imani hesitated for a moment, the old instinct to refuse help warring with the bone-deep relief of being protected. She got into the car, and as the city blurred past the windows, she felt the weight of her fear lifting, ounce by agonizing ounce. The workday at the dental office, where she had once felt like a cornered animal every time the front door chimed, took on a different energy. Her coworkers noticed the change. They had seen her flinch at shadows for months, but today she sat at the reception desk with her shoulders squared and her sharp, expressive eyes clear. She didn't check her phone every 5 minutes to see if Victor had tracked her location. She didn't scan the faces of the patients for a familiar, jagged jawline. She simply worked. Throughout the day, subtle signs of Yimin's presence filtered into her world, like a guardian with a dragon's bite. A delivery arrived at noon, a simple, nutritious lunch from one of the luxury restaurants in the city. There was no note, only a subtle silver-embossed dragon logo on the bag. Later, a professional-looking woman approached the desk, handed Imani a new, encrypted mobile phone, and whispered that Mr. Seo wished to ensure her communications remained private. It wasn't control. It was a fortress being built around her digital life. In the late afternoon, as the sun began to dip behind the skyscrapers, Imani took a walk through a nearby park, a place she had avoided for months because the open spaces made her feel vulnerable. She sat on a bench, watching the butterflies and the koi fish in a small pond, breathing in the scent of damp earth and blooming flowers. She realized that for the first time since escaping Victor, she wasn't calculating the distance to the nearest exit. She was simply existing in the moment. She thought about Yi Min, the man who had lost his own sense of peace and now seemed determined to gift her hers. He monitored her from a distance, never intruding on her space, yet making his presence felt through the absolute safety that now surrounded her. It was a strange, intoxicating feeling, to be valued not for what she could provide, but simply because she deserved to be safe. As the shadows lengthened, she saw the black sedan waiting at the edge of the park. The driver stood by the door, a silent sentinel of the man whose rumored ties to organized crime didn't frighten her anymore. To the world, Yi Min was a man to be feared, a figure of cold resolve and calculated power. But to Imani, he was the person who had stepped into the light when everyone else had turned away. She walked toward the car, her pace steady and her head held high. The fear was still there, a small, cold coal in the pit of her stomach, but it was no longer a roaring fire. As the door was held open for her, she looked at the black card tucked into her purse. She was no longer a victim fleeing a predator. She was a woman under the protection of a dragon. And as she took that first, full breath of freedom, she knew that the life she was building was finally, truly her own. The illusion of peace shattered with the sound of glass splintering against the hardwood floor of the dental office. It was late Tuesday afternoon, the golden hour when the city usually began to quiet, but the tranquility was incinerated the moment Victor Kane kicked through the front door. He didn't look like the polished man from the restaurant. He looked like a cornered animal, eyes bloodshot and jaw set in a jagged, desperate line of rage. The muscular build that had once made Imani feel safe now felt like an encroaching wall of violence. He ignored the gasps of the patients and the frantic movements of the staff, his intense eyes locked onto Imani behind the reception desk. Imani felt the cold spike of adrenaline hit her heart, but unlike the 1,000 times before, she didn't duck under the desk. She reached into her pocket, her fingers brushing the cool, matte surface of Yi Min's card. The black sedan was parked outside, but Victor had timed his entry with the departure of a delivery truck, creating a 30-second window of chaos. He lunged over the counter, his large hands reaching for her hair, his brows furrowed in a mask of possessive aggression. "You think some suit with tattoos can keep me from what's mine?" he roared, his voice thick with the smell of stale alcohol and unhinged resentment. Imani scrambled backward, her oval face pale but her gaze steady. She didn't scream for the police. She pressed the speed dial on the encrypted phone Yi Min had provided. Victor's fingers snagged the collar of her blouse, the fabric straining as he tried to pull her toward him. He wanted to see her break. He wanted the satisfaction of the fear he had spent 3 years cultivating. But as he leaned close, whispering a promise of the pain he would inflict once he got her away from the guards, the atmosphere in the room didn't just change, it froze. The door didn't open, it was simply filled. Yi Min Seo walked into the office with the rhythmic, powerful gait of a man who owned the air he breathed. He wasn't rushed, and he wasn't shouting. He looked at the chaos with a cold, controlled expression that made Victor's frantic energy look pathetic. Beside Yi Min stood 2 of his men, their shoulders squared and their faces masks of professional indifference. The silent authority Yi Min radiated was so heavy that the rest of the room went still, the patients holding their breath as they watched the dragon enter the cave. Victor didn't let go of Imani's collar immediately. He tried to double down, his muscular frame tensing as he pulled her closer, using her as a human shield. "Stay back!" he yelled, his voice cracking with a fear he was trying to hide behind bravado. "She's coming with me. This is between us." Yi Min didn't stop moving. He walked until he was a mere arm's length from the counter, his sharp cheekbones caught in the harsh fluorescent lighting of the office. He didn't look at Victor's face. He looked at the hand gripping Imani's clothes. Slowly, with a focus that was more terrifying than any scream, Yi Min began to roll up his sleeves. The dark, intricate dragon tattoos emerged, the ink seemingly poolsing against his muscular forearms. "I gave you 5 minutes at the restaurant," Yi Min said, his voice a low, melodic rumble that vibrated in the floorboards. "I told you that if I saw your face again, you would learn a lesson you wouldn't survive. You chose to ignore the warning. That was your fatal mistake." The 2 men flanking Yi Min moved with a synchronized, lethal efficiency. They didn't wait for a command. One moved to the left, the other to the right, cutting off Victor's only path of escape. Victor looked around, his eyes darting like a trapped rat. The realization began to sink in that he wasn't dealing with a rival or a jealous lover. He was dealing with an institution. He looked at Yimin's eyes, cold, calculating, and utterly devoid of mercy, and his grip on Amani finally faltered. Yimin reached out, his hand moving so fast it was a blur, and gripped Victor's throat. It was a mirror of the violence Victor had inflicted on Amani, but the power behind it was tectonic. He lifted Victor, forcing the larger man onto his toes, his face turning a dark, mottled purple. The aggression in Victor's eyes was replaced by a pure, unadulterated terror. "You don't own her," Yimin hissed, his face inches from Victor's. "You never did. You are a bug beneath my shoe, and I have decided it is time to stop walking around you." With a flick of his wrist, Yimin threw Victor toward his men, who caught him with a brutal, practiced grace. They didn't take him out the front door. They led him toward the back exit, their movements quiet and final. The room was silent again, save for the sound of Amani's steady, deep breaths. She looked at Yimin, who was now adjusting his cuffs, his expression softening as he turned his focus to her. He didn't ask if she was okay. He saw the fire in her large, expressive eyes and knew the survivor had finally found her shield. "He won't be returning to your home, and he won't be coming to your office," Yimin stated, his voice absolute. "The time for warnings is over. Now we begin the erasure." The alleyway behind the dental office was a world of cold concrete and long, jagged shadows, a stark contrast to the sterile white lights inside. Victor Kane lay on the damp ground, his muscular frame trembling not from the cold, but from a primal, bone-deep terror he had never before experienced. He scrambled backward, his heels catching on the grit of the pavement until his spine hit the brick wall of the building. The two men in black suits stood like twin pillars of shadow at the mouth of the alley, their silent authority ensuring that no one would interrupt the lesson that was about to begin. Yimin Seo stepped into the dim light of a single flickering street lamp, his athletic, powerful physique casting a long, intimidating silhouette over the fallen man. He didn't look like a man who had just engaged in a struggle. His white fitted shirt was still crisp, and his cold, controlled expression remained as sharp as his jawline. With a rhythmic, deliberate motion, he began to roll his sleeves back up, revealing the dark dragon tattoos that seemed to pulse with a life of their own in the twilight. "You think your rage makes you strong, Victor," Yimin said, his voice a low, melodic rumble that carried the weight of a final judgment. "But rage is the weapon of a child. It is erratic, loud, and ultimately hollow." Victor tried to find his voice, his brows furrowed in a desperate attempt to reclaim the aggression that had served him for 3 years. "You can't just take her. She knows she belongs to me," he spat, though the words lacked their usual venom. He looked at Yimin's focused, intense eyes and saw a void where his own fear should have been reflected. Yimin stepped closer, his Italian leather shoes clicking against the stone with a sound like a ticking clock. "Ownership is a delusion of the weak," he stated, his tone devoid of the frantic heat that characterized Victor's outbursts. "You are a bully, Victor. You prey on the silence and the fear of a woman who is too good for you, but a professional preys on people like you." Before Victor could react, Yimin moved. It wasn't a wild swing or a blind rush. It was a series of precise, surgical strikes that targeted the very foundations of Victor's physical confidence. A sharp jab to the nerve cluster in the shoulder, a heavy palm strike to the diaphragm, and a sweep that sent Victor's legs out from under him once more. Each movement was a testament to a lifetime of disciplined violence, a stark contrast to the messy, uncoordinated brutality Victor had used to terrorize Amani. Victor gasped, his lungs seizing as the air was systematically driven out of his body. He clutched at his chest, his muscular arms feeling leaden and useless. He looked up at Yimin and realized that for the first time in his life, he was the one being hunted. The predator had become the prey, and the rules of the game had been rewritten by a man who didn't recognize his authority. "Every time you touched her, every time you made her look over her shoulder, you were drawing a map to your own destruction," Yimin hissed, leaning down until his face was inches from Victor's. The scent of expensive cologne and cold resolve was far more terrifying than any smell of alcohol or rage. "You thought you were the most dangerous thing in her world. You were wrong. I am." Yimin reached out and grabbed Victor by the front of his shirt, hauling him up until they were eye to eye. The dragon tattoos on Yimin's forearms were inches away, the ink a dark promise of the erasure to come. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. The authority in his voice was absolute, the kind of power that didn't require volume to be heard. "You will stay in this alley until my men decide you are fit to crawl away," Yimin instructed, his grip tightening. "And while you lie here, I want you to think about every property you own, every cent in your bank account, and every friend you think will help you. By the time the sun rises tomorrow, they will all begin to disappear. You didn't just harass a woman today, Victor. You declared war on an empire." With a flick of his wrist, Yimin released him, watching with disgust as Victor slumped back into the shadows. Yimin stood upright, his shoulders squared and his breath steady, showing no sign of the exertion. He pulled his sleeves back down, hiding the dragons once more, and adjusted his cuffs with meticulous care. He turned his back on the broken man, walking toward the mouth of the alley without a second glance. The two men in suits fell in behind him, their presence a silent guarantee that the handled threat would remain handled. As Yimin stepped back into the street, the cool evening air felt different, cleaner, sharper. He knew that Imani was safe inside, protected by a wall of men who followed a law older than the city itself. The professional had done his work, and the bully was left in the dark, finally understanding the true cost of his obsession. The evening air was cooling as Yimin's Siho led Imani away from the jagged shadows of the alleyway and toward a private garden restaurant tucked behind high, ivy-covered stone walls. The transition from the violence of the confrontation to the serene trickling of a koi pond was jarring, but Yimin's presence remained a steady, grounding force. He moved with a rhythmic, powerful gait, his shoulders squared as he gestured for her to sit at a secluded table overlooking the water. For a long moment, the only sound was the rustle of leaves, and the distant hum of the city he seemed to rule with a silent authority. Imani watched him as he finally sat across from her. He was no longer the icy executioner from the alley. The sharp cheekbones and intense eyes had softened, though the cold resolve remained a permanent fixture of his expression. She looked at his powerful forearms, where the dark dragon tattoos were now hidden beneath his crisp white sleeves. The silence between them wasn't heavy with the threat of Victor's return, but with the weight of the questions Imani had been carrying since the night at the restaurant. "You don't just protect people because it's the right thing to do," Imani said softly, her large, expressive eyes searching his face. "A man with your power, with your reach, there is always a reason why you choose to stand in the gap. Why me? Why now?" Yimin remained quiet for a long time, his gaze fixed on the flickering candlelight between them. When he finally spoke, his voice was a low, melodic rumble, but it lacked its usual edge of command. It sounded tired, worn by the ghosts of a life Imani could only begin to imagine. He told her about the empire he had built, not out of greed, but out of a desperate, clawing need for the kind of control he had once lacked. He spoke of a time, nearly a decade ago, when he was not a man to be feared, but a man who had been forced to watch his own world burn. He revealed the tragedy that haunted the foundations of his hotels and restaurants, a car accident caused by a man who believed his status and wealth made him untouchable. Yimin had lost a wife and a 6-year-old daughter that night, victims of a predator who thought the rules didn't apply to him. He hadn't been there to stop it. He had been at a business meeting, building a future that was incinerated in a single red-light-running moment of arrogance. The man responsible had walked away with a minimal sentence, protected by the very influence Yimin now wielded like a blade. "I spent years trying to figure out what to do with the power I accumulated after they were gone," Yimin admitted, his eyes locking onto hers with a vulnerability that made Imani's breath catch. "I realized that I couldn't bring them back, but I could make sure that people like Victor Kane never got to finish what they started. When I saw you at that restaurant, I didn't just see a woman being harassed. I saw the moment I failed my own family. And I decided, then and there, that it wouldn't happen again." Revelation sent a chill through Imani that had nothing to do with the evening breeze. She reached across the table, her hand hesitating before she placed it over his. His skin was warm, a stark contrast to the cold, calculating persona he showed the world. In that moment, she realized that the rumors surrounding him were only a fraction of the truth. He wasn't just a man of organized crime or business ventures. He was a man who had turned his grief into a fortress for those the system had abandoned. "You're not just a shield," Imani whispered, her voice thick with an emotion she hadn't felt in 3 years. "You're a ghost of the empire you lost." Yimin almost smiled, a brief, tragic flash of warmth that didn't quite reach his eyes. He didn't pull his hand away. Instead, he gripped hers, his long fingers providing a firm, steady pressure that made her feel more than just safe. She felt seen. He explained that his life was complicated and dangerous, and that being close to him carried risks of its own. But he also promised that as long as he drew breath, no one would ever make her look over her shoulder again. As the moon rose over the private garden, Imani realized that the survivor she had been was finally being replaced by something else. She wasn't just escaping a predator anymore. She was being drawn into the orbit of a man who understood the true cost of protection. The silence of the night was no longer a threat. It was a sanctuary, built by a dragon who knew exactly what it meant to lose everything. The erasure did not begin with a roar, but with the cold, silent efficiency of a falling blade. While Imani slept in the newfound sanctuary of her apartment, guarded by men whose presence had become a comforting shadow, Yi Min Seo sat in a high-rise office that overlooked the city's glowing veins. He didn't need to throw another punch. The physical confrontation had merely been the prologue. Now he moved through the digital and legal landscape with the same rhythmic, powerful gait he used in the physical world. With a single nod to his associates, he initiated the systematic dismantling of Victor Kane's existence. The first strike hit Victor where he felt most invincible, his pride and his pocketbook. By the time the sun began to peek over the horizon, Victor's primary commercial property, a trendy downtown gym that served as his fortress of ego, was swarmed by city inspectors and federal auditors. Every minor violation that had been overlooked for years was suddenly brought into the harsh light of day. Permits were revoked, bank accounts were frozen under suspicion of irregular activity, and the silent authority of Yimin's reach ensured that no lawyer in the city would take Victor's frantic calls. Yimin watched the reports filter in on his screen, his sharp cheekbones caught in the blue light of the monitor. His expression remains cold and controlled. As Imani went about her day, she felt the ripples of this invisible war. She sat at her desk at the dental office, no longer flinching when the door opened. She knew that the man who had stalked her for 3 years was currently being buried under the weight of his own crimes. Yimin didn't just want Victor gone, he wanted him erased. He wanted every vestige of the power Victor had used to terrorize Imani to be ground into dust. This was the Cinderella story with a dark, vigilante twist. The prince wasn't just bringing a glass slipper, he was burning down the villain's castle. By noon, Victor's luxury car was towed from the street for a litany of unpaid fines and registration discrepancies that had materialized overnight. His friends, men who had once enabled his bullying behavior, suddenly found their own businesses under scrutiny. They abandoned him with the speed of rats fleeing a sinking ship, realizing that standing next to Victor Kane was now a death sentence for their own reputations. Yimin's connections to the city's elite meant that Victor's name was now toxic. He was being socially and financially lobotomized, stripped of the status he used as a weapon. Imani met Yimin for a brief walk in the late afternoon. He was dressed in a charcoal suit, his sleeves down for once, hiding the dragons that had done the heavy lifting the night before. He looked at her with focused, intense eyes, checking for any sign of lingering trauma. He didn't boast about the millions Victor was losing or the properties that were being seized. He simply walked beside her, his shoulders squared, offering a presence that made the air feel lighter. "He is learning that the world is much larger than his rage," Yimin said, his voice a low, melodic rumble. "He relied on your fear to feel tall. Now that you are no longer afraid, he is realizing how small he truly is." Imani looked at him, her large, expressive eyes filled with a mixture of awe and a quiet, budding hope. She realized that Yimin wasn't just protecting her. He was reclaiming the scales of justice that had been tipped against her for so long. He was the ghost of the empire, using his dark influence to create a world where a woman like her could finally breathe. The systematic erasure was more than just a punishment for Victor. It was a gift of silence for Imani, a silence where she could finally hear her own voice again. As the sun set, Victor found himself standing in the lobby of his own apartment building, only to realize the electronic key fob no longer worked. His belongings were being packed into boxes by silent men in dark suits, moved to a storage facility he couldn't access. He had gone from a man who believed he owned a woman to a man who didn't even own the roof over his head. Yimin's work was nearly complete. The bully had been neutralized, the threat had been handled, and now the very ground beneath Victor's feet was being pulled away. The end of Victor Kane was not a spectacular explosion, but a cold, clinical evaporation of his entire world. He stood on the rain-slicked pavement outside the private airport terminal, clutching a single duffel bag, the only possession Yimin Seo had allowed him to keep. The muscular frame that had once loomed over a Manny with such suffocating dominance now looked hollowed out, his shoulders hunched against a wind that seemed to blow only for him. He looked at the sleek, unmarked jet idling on the tarmac, its engines a low, predatory hum in the gray morning. There were no cameras, no police, and no audience for his downfall. There was only the silent authority of the men in dark suits who stood between him and the city he had once terrorized. Yimin Seo stepped out from the terminal, his rhythmic, powerful gait echoing against the concrete. He was dressed in a black overcoat that made his tall, athletic frame look like a shadow cast across Victor's future. He stopped a few feet away, his focused, intense eyes devoid of even the smallest spark of anger. To Yimin, Victor was no longer a rival or even a threat. He was a task that was finally being completed. With a slow, deliberate motion, Yimin reached for his gloves, adjusting them with the same meticulous care he used when rolling up his sleeves. "You have no properties left in this country, Victor," Yimin said, his voice a low, melodic rumble that felt as final as a gavel. "No bank accounts, no business interests, and not a single soul who will speak your name without a shudder of fear. You are leaving with the only thing you truly own, your life, and that is a gift you did not earn." Victor looked up, his brows furrowed in a final, pathetic attempt at defiance. "You can't do this," he rasped, his voice thin and cracked. "You can't just erase a man." "I am not erasing a man," Yimin corrected him, his sharp cheekbones catching the light as he tilted his head. "I am erasing a cancer. You spent 3 years convincing a woman she was nothing without you. Now you will learn what it feels like to truly be nothing. The flight leaves in 10 minutes. It is a one-way ticket to a place where no one knows your name and where my reach is just as long as it is here. If you ever set foot on this soil again, if you even whisper the name Imani Rhodes, you will find out what happens when I stop being patient." The two men flanking Yimin stepped forward, their presence a silent, muscular guarantee of the Korean Mafia rumors that had become Victor's reality. They didn't have to touch him. The sheer weight of Yimin's resolve was enough to push Victor toward the plane. He walked with the heavy, stumbling steps of a man who had lost his gravity, his eyes darting back toward the city's skyline one last time. But the city didn't belong to him anymore. It belonged to the man in the black overcoat, and to the woman that man had sworn to protect. While the jet ascended into the overcast sky, Imani sat in the new townhouse Yimin had arranged for her. It was a space of hardwood floors, large windows, and an overwhelming sense of peace. She sat by the window, her large, expressive eyes watching the rain wash the dust from the glass. For the first time in 3 years, she didn't feel like she was hiding. She didn't feel like a ghost. She felt the heavy, velvet cloak of Yimin's protection draped around her, a shield that had finally, permanently, broken the cycle of her trauma. She looked at the encrypted phone on the table. A message appeared, simple and absolute. "The departure is complete. You are free." Imani let out a breath she felt she had been holding since her late 20s. The systematic erasure was over. The bully had been stripped of his properties, his status, and his ability to cause pain. He was a ghost now, wandering a world that had no place for him, while Imani stood on solid ground. She thought of Yimin, the man who had lost his own family and chose to build a fortress for hers. He was more than a protector. He was the architect of her new life. As the morning light finally broke through the clouds, casting a golden glow over the quiet street, Imani realized she was no longer looking for an exit. She was looking at a beginning. The final transformation had started the moment Yimin rolled up his sleeves in that restaurant, and now, as the predator vanished into the clouds, the survivor was finally, truly home. The city began to glow with the soft, amber light of a sunset that finally felt like a promise instead of a deadline. Inside the new townhouse, the air was still, but it was no longer heavy. The hardwood floors and spacious living room were filled with a warmth that Imani Rhodes had forgotten existed. She stood by the large windows, her natural textured curls framing an oval face that had finally shed its mask of perpetual panic. For the first time in 3 years, she didn't check the locks every 20 minutes, and she didn't jump when the central heating clicked into place. She was a woman who had been saved by a man who chose to rebuild her entire world. And as she heard the rhythmic, powerful gait of Yi Min Seo approaching the front door, her heart beat with anticipation rather than terror. Yi Min entered the room with his usual silent authority, his tall, athletic frame dressed in a simple but expensive white fitted shirt, the sleeves rolled down to hide the dragons that had secured her freedom. He didn't look like a ghost of an empire tonight. He looked like a man who had found a new reason to build one. He walked toward her, his sharp cheekbones catching the fatting light, and stopped just close enough for her to feel the steady, grounding heat of his presence. He didn't offer a polite greeting or small talk. Instead, his focused, intense eyes locked onto hers with a vulnerability that mirrored her own. "Victor is gone, Imani," he said, his voice a low, melodic rumble that carried the weight of a final guarantee. "His properties are seized, his influence is incinerated, and he will never breathe the same air as you again. But I didn't do all of this just to give you a temporary reprieve. I didn't roll up my sleeves at that restaurant just to be a passing shadow in your life." Imani looked up at him, her large, expressive eyes clear and steady for the first time. She thought about the black card, the encrypted phone, and the men who had stood as silent sentinels between her and the predator. She realized that she was no longer just a survivor living in a state of drowning. She was a woman standing on the shore, being offered a hand by the only person who understood the true cost of safety. Yi Min reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, elegant box. He didn't go down on one knee. He stood before her as her equal and her shield. He opened the box to reveal a simple, stunning promise ring, a circle of silver that represented a law far more powerful than the restraining orders that had failed her in the past. "If you choose me, my world will always be complicated, and it will always be dangerous to those who wish us harm. But I am promising you now, with everything I am and everything I am capable of, that I will never let anyone hurt you again. This isn't a date, and it isn't a casual offer. I am asking to be your partner and your protector permanently. I am asking you to be mine, so that I can take care of what is mine for the rest of our lives." The tears that filled Imani's eyes were not born of fear, but of a profound, overwhelming relief. She thought about the 3 years of terror, the hand on her neck at the restaurant, and the way Yi Min had looked as he systematically erased the man who tried to destroy her. She looked at the ring, then at the man whose dragon tattoos were a testament to the fact that he was willing to fight the monsters so she wouldn't have to. "Yes," she whispered, her voice stronger than it had ever been during her time with Victor. "I choose you, Yi Min. I choose this life." He took her hand, his long fingers sliding the ring onto her finger with a slow, deliberate precision. He then stepped closer, cupping her face with both hands, a gesture that was gentle, controlled, and absolutely certain. When he kissed her, it wasn't a tentative beginning, it was a claim. It was the sound of a door locking forever on her past and a window opening on a future where she was finally, truly, untouchable. As they stood together in the quiet townhouse, watching the city lights stretch out below them like stars, Imani realized the final transformation was complete. She was no longer a victim hiding in the shadows. She was a woman claimed by a dragon, protected by an empire, and finally safe enough to love. The silence of the night was no longer a threat, it was a sanctuary. And for the first time since she could remember, Imani Rhodes was home.